I think it's going to work. I'll start the comments here. Oh. All right. Thank you so much for being here. Great to see you back again for Bach on the Road. We had some excitement or lack of excitement last time, I guess, when Facebook didn't work at all. Everything got started late. Looks like we're back in business today on Facebook and YouTube. I'll be following your comments and questions on Facebook since we're up and running. We find ourselves today, Bach finds himself in Iran, or ancient, well, not exactly ancient Persia, but here we have the Vank Cathedral, or at least a mural inside. And it's actually my birthday, so I'm thrilled to spend it with you guys, at least this little slice of it, and taking our last look at the B minor partita of Bach. This has been really fun so far, both the G minor and this one. It's interesting to put these two next to each other. I mean, even though I've studied the 6 sonatas and partitas at various times, the G minor, the one that I've performed the most, this B minor, the one that I've performed the least. And so it's been a lot of fun to explore that in this setting with you guys. So let me know, as always, where you're visiting from, and thanks thanks for the birthday wishes too. I appreciate that. Ever since I was a kid, I think it was one of my teachers that I had a lesson on my birthday or something like that, and one of my teachers said, now you're 9 or whatever age it was, and now you've got to play better in tune. And that has haunted me every birthday since then. I wake up every birthday morning thinking I've got to play better in tune, and I'm not sure that I've always been able to achieve that, and one of these birthdays I'm sure will be the last one where that's going to be true, but I'm going to try to put off that day as long as possible. So let's get started. We've just to recap, whether you've been with us for the other looks at the B minor or not, this partita, 4 dance movements each with its own double, and so we started with the Allemande, the Courante, and then last session we started the Sarabande, and we didn't even start looking at the double of the Sarabande actually. So today we'll do that, and then look at the last movement as well, the Bourree and its double. I was thinking, since we were with each other on Wednesday, how much more difficult or interesting these questions of tempo are in the partitas, as opposed to the sonatas. I don't want to say that Bach made all the decisions for us in the sonatas, because there's still plenty of room to play around with that, but the characters are a little bit more clear for me, and some of the technical demands, like especially in the fugues, just lend themselves better to certain tempos. I feel like it's less wide open, whereas we'll see in all these partitas you can really do just such a broad range, and so it's a lot of fun to play around with those. So if you remember, we were playing around with the Sarabande and just how danceable we wanted it to be, and what kind of dance even it might be. So just to remind ourselves of one of the tempos we played around with the last time. And if we just took that exact same tempo that exact same tempo and put it right into the double. And that works quite well. Nothing wrong with that. And I gave you a taste of a couple different lengths for the notes. Not dramatically different, but more connected the first time you noticed, and a little bit more air the second time. What I want to avoid is either to have it sounding fussy on the shorter end, like I'm really got to put effort into each note's articulation. I don't want that. I would rather have air if they're going to be slightly shorter notes. Not to be too stingy with the bow. And on the other side, if I'm going to connect them a little bit more, not to have them too gluey, right? I don't want... And that has to do, I think, not only with the length of the notes, in other words, not putting spaces in between, but what kind of sound. That's a very concentrated sound. And as we've seen again and again in, well, this music or any music, but specifically in these Bach sonatas and partitas, if you don't shape, your listeners' ears will be drawn to your bow stroke, and everybody's going to find something to dislike. So no matter what length, what stroke I choose, I have to have that direction, that shape, which should be informed by the harmony. Remember that, these double movements use basically, and in some cases pretty exactly, the same chords as the main movements. If I play a bit of the second half of the Sarabande and then a bit of the second half of the double, you can basically shape them the same way. And now the double. Back if you're taking the repeats. Now let's say we wanted to play around with the tempo a little, because I don't find it necessary to have an exact tempo equivalent between the dance and the double. I think that if you're going to connect directly from a dance into the double, then it's nicer to have an equivalent tempo. If you're making more space, then I think you have more license to change the tempo. Here's how that might look. The end of the Sarabande. And some, actually, if I turn back a little bit, looking at the courant, that's one where a lot of times people will chain the dance and the double almost directly together. There's no fermata on the last note of the courant. There's a fermata on the final bar line. Sometimes people ignore that a little bit. That can, that can help prevent this suite from sounding like just 8 movements and you got the same weight after each one. Let me look at a few comments and questions from you here and scroll up. And working on intonation. Now I hope that wasn't a hint. It should always be a hint, actually. Great. Well, I think we opened this look at the B minor partita back on Monday, talking about the difference between this key and something like G minor, or even what's going to be coming up next week, the A minor sonata, or certainly the D minor partita. Here in B minor, that's the key out of all of these that resonates the least well on the violin. In the triad, we've only got one note that's an open string, or even very sympathetic with an open string. At least with C major, you've got E's and G's in the triad, and so you've got more open strings available. And in a way, that actually makes the B minor the most useful one to use to work on intonation, because you have so few open strings and so few notes that just resonate naturally. Your ear is constantly being asked to compare notes to each other. And so if I'm looking at this double, for example, so when you ask about how to work on intonation, I keep talking about horizontal intonation and vertical intonation. Horizontal, again, meaning melodic. What makes sense to my ear, thinking of this as a line, as a melody. Most of the time it's satisfying to have half steps pretty close. Vertical intonation is, literally, it can be vertical like in a double stop or a chord, or I extend that to mean anytime that I'm comparing notes that need to either match or sound together in an implied chord. So something like these first 3 notes of the double, I can listen for them horizontally like a melody and see if I just like each note, but it's more useful here to listen to it vertically, to imagine that it's a chord. What would sound good for them together? So one thing's a given, the perfect fifth has to be a perfect fifth. So I know where my B and my F sharp are going to have to go. So it's really only a question of where that D sounds good. And without getting too technical, not because I don't think you guys can handle it, but actually because I don't know and I'm not particularly interested in all the theory of the different tuning systems. So without getting too much into that, we know there are different places that the third of a chord can go. Let's start with the D that rings with the open D. And I can tell it rings. I bet that comes through even in this setting. Let's say it was a little higher than that, you hear how that sound just stops. There, the ring continues for several seconds because I get the help from the open D and the body of the instrument and all that. So if we use that as a starting point, let's see how that would work. So goes without saying that next D should match the one I just played. That's a lot of Ds in this opening, isn't it? They should all match. That's another example of what I think of as vertical intonation. Matching notes across octaves, matching perfect intervals. So by switching between those two modes and doing the same passage, listening horizontally and listening vertically, it needs to be satisfying both ways. Sometimes that means you've got to compromise. Sometimes the melodic line has to compromise because you've got perfect intervals somewhere else that are going to sound even worse if they're not ringing true. Sometimes the vertical sense has to suffer a little. Like maybe I've got the chord changes, and so I've got the same note I just played somewhere else, but now it's in a new chord, and so I'm going to put that note in a different place. Therefore, those two don't match, but ultimately more satisfying. I have fun playing around with these things, and your listeners can tell when you've put some thought into this, and certainly they can tell when you haven't, because chords don't ring and they're not satisfying. Great, I'm so happy you get the ring, but actually that makes me nervous now too, because if you don't hear the ring, then you'll know I'm not playing in tune. Now we've talked again about how I don't believe that these doubles have to be an exact match in tempo. Sometimes they can be more purely instrumental. You know, if he really just wanted a dance suite, he could have written just the dance movements and no doubles. So what if we took this, I was thinking in both directions. A lot of times the doubles go faster because we're not bound by the rules of dance. Let's see what that might be. Again, our tempo for the Sarabande was something like... Let's take this faster for the double. It's tempting. I don't know if you guys have ever compared, well, surely you've compared instruments, compared violins. It's a funny thing. The ear almost always gravitates toward the louder instrument, right? You play one, you play another one next to it. If it's louder, yeah, you say, and it happens to me, it happens to everybody. It's just human nature. At least for the first 5 seconds or so. And then our ear adjusts and we're able to hear quality. It's a similar thing with tempo, I often find. It's on first hearing, a faster tempo usually sounds more persuasive. Not always, but usually. And so it's tempting always to just let it move as much as possible, as much as technically possible. Let's actually take it the other way and see if we might persuade ourselves or each other. Again, our Sarabande tempo we were working from. So slower than that. It's going to be more searching, I guess. I could be convinced. There's obviously more time for the little picture, if you want to call it that. Fast tempo is great for the big picture. I can really take you, or you can take your listeners from one chord to the next, really show what the important moments are, move through the ones that are more transitory. Here at this slower tempo, I start to notice groups of two notes. I start to hear the bass line in a little more relief. If I look at the third bar, we've got an implied bass line. That's very satisfying. Now that first note, the B, is in a different octave. And we don't get the F sharp until, but it's an F sharp major chord nonetheless. So and here, the clear progression. So bass line, easier to make it stand out in relief. And these little pairs or groups of notes, something like these. So more time to let big intervals sound different from smaller intervals. Curious to see what your impressions are about those tempos. Well, I'm just as happy to get birthday wishes too. More, bring them on. Yeah, I have to say, obviously this is a fairly low-key birthday. This is one of the more festive things I'm doing today. And then I got a beautiful, elaborate pastry creation from my wife, who's an expert baker. She put together, I don't know how many, it must have been 50 or 60 cream puffs, pastry puffs, each filled with cream, and they were stuck together in a tower with a caramel. Just amazing. So that's, that's my best present today. But your wishes make this even more special, so thank you for that. All right, I've got a couple. Ingrid and Becky both like the slower tempo. So what do you know? The fast tempo was not more convincing on first hearing. And, it's funny how much listeners will really, notice or pay attention to that on just one hearing. You play the whole suite through. The most important thing, right, is that you're convinced yourself, and then you have something to say, that you're choosing your tempo based on the character that you want. Obviously, this slower tempo, as I said, more searching. That can be a great thing. More time to search gives you more time to find, more time for your listeners to find. And I think it should be matched by the kind of sound, right? In the faster tempo, relatively not a pressed sound by any means, but more concentrated. I wouldn't exactly want that, would I? Sounds a little ordinary. And would be enhanced, of course, by a space like I'm pretending to be in. Well, we've got mostly more votes for slow than fast at the moment, which is interesting. I was genuinely curious how that would come across. And then the question about the bowing, this is looking at the manuscript again. If the back of this cheap version, as many people like to say, the best part of this book is the back. Maybe not being entirely fair to Mr. Galamian, but is basically written with all separate bows. Curious there, yeah, actually, yeah, all separate bows, which doesn't mean that everybody has to play them all separate. In fact, it might be a nice clue that Bach was really leaving it to you, the performer, to add your own variations on that. You know, for the movements where there are some slurs, some separates, that to me implies, well, there was maybe a little bit more careful construction put into where the slurs were going to be. Whereas if it's all blank, then maybe that implies more freedom. And that's a nice thing to do on a repeat. We talked about varying the note lengths maybe, but certainly the slurs you could do as well. There are certain patterns that lend themselves more naturally to two-note slurs. You know, you wouldn't want to just throw them in anywhere. You can end up with some really odd patterns. To me, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but something like, or and then stepwise things, something like that, can often work very well as longer slurs. Just as if you're playing them with separate bows, those often work well in longer strokes, either stepwise or straight arpeggios, something like that. So, you know, it's wide open. I think if this is a piece that you're getting to perform several times in a short space, that's a situation where you can really develop that comfort to mix it up in the moment. If you're not getting a lot of chances in a pretty short period of time to play this for people, then, you know, it's always been my policy or my comfort level to plan my bowings. I just don't love getting stuck somewhere where I'm uncomfortable just, you know, to try to prove that I can improvise in front of people. But, you know, that'll change. I'll get to perform this one more and try some more things out in the moment. I'm going to look at a couple more comments before we move to the Bourree. Amy says the older she gets, the more prefers slower tempos, and that seems to be just human nature. I'm thinking, well, Glenn Gould famously had his, you know, Goldberg recording that was just blew everybody's mind with how fast and clean it was, but with musical integrity too. And then when he went back years later to record it again, much slower. Also, now that's Bach, but also thinking of Beethoven, the Guarneri String Quartet, the quartet that I've listened to the most and admired the most, you know, for so many years. They did 2 complete recording cycles of all the Beethoven quartets, and they found, with a few exceptions, they found that their later recordings had slower tempos. And Arnold Steinhardt, their first violinist, writes about that in his book Indivisible by Four. And I believe the quartet talks about it as well in their wonderful joint book called The Art of Quartet Playing. Talk about that phenomenon, maybe just wanting more time to appreciate the beauty. And then Joan, you ask, once you go through all this and then maybe you decide you want to put some slurs in, and how might that influence the tempo? And yes, I think it does. Or one could say the tempo might influence the slurs. If it's very fast, certain slurs might not work as well, especially the ones with string crossings and things like that. I think when it's faster, also you don't have to worry as much about the tapering of the slur. what I mean is you can play the notes more or less evenly. If it's slower and you do slurs like that, then you really have to start thinking, or, how much do you diminish? How much space do you leave in the second note of the slur? Because then that's a lot more audible. It doesn't just move through. So that you would have to think about as well. And absolutely, that's a great point, that the tempo and the articulations always have to be considered together. Jefferson, you ask about, preparing this for a competition, for example, and how important, scales and especially double stop scales would be. I think whether it's for a competition or for anything, performances, you mentioned lessons, scales are going to be crucial. It's just any problems that you don't solve in scales and arpeggios, double stop practice, you're going to have to solve in the music. And then that takes not only time away from interpretive, all these interesting and fun questions that we've been talking about and experimenting with so far. If I've got a fiddle with, this double stop being in tune and this arpeggio being in tune and this scale being in tune, I'm hardly going to have any time to play around with tempos and articulations, and I'm going to get to the performance just barely having put it together. Whereas if those things, if I've worked on them already in scales and etudes, then I can kind of hit the ground running. And I'll have more to say about that as we go on, but I'm so glad you brought that up, because it makes you feel so much freer when you play this music, and that is always going to come out in the interpretation and in your confidence at how you can play these. So I'll have more to say about scale routine and the importance of, it's not just getting in shape, but it's getting in the kind of shape that translates directly to playing this music and to performing it, even when you get nervous, as I'm sometimes nervous in front of you guys. Great. Let's look at the Bourree. This has some interesting difficulties right off the bat, kind of like the first movement. And the only thing is that this is a faster movement. In the first movement, we started out like that. And, I cautioned you guys not to pick up the bow unless you have to. I won't say it's wrong, and there are better ways to do it and worse ways to do it. But if you had to pick it up, my advice was just the minimal amount. But anytime you pick it up, you've got to put it back down, and that landing can tend to be a crash landing. So, I was hoping that you could change the levels silently. Here, this is a faster movement. We've got... There's not much time to get over to the G string, and so conversely, since this is a faster tempo, I find myself picking up the bow just to make sure that I can get over there cleanly. The other movement I had time to cross. Here. So Plus, it's just a more assertive character, so I don't mind getting a little bit of that. Now, I don't do a crash landing, right? I let the bow meet the string, then pull it. So this was a movement I've brought up Joseph Silverstein many times so far in our Bach journey, former concertmaster of the Boston Symphony and a great player of Bach. He demonstrated this movement and how it would sound from a thoughtless violinist who only was concerned about the melody, and so he kind of exaggerated and made fun. So that the melody's always coming on the beat. Obviously, that sounds silly. As with so many other moments in this box so far, we've got to make some kind of rhythmic compromise. Either the bass is going to be early or the melody is going to be late. And we can't exactly play 4 notes at once without multi-tracking. So, what I like to do, and here the character supports it, is a very quick roll. It's almost like, I talk about 2 and 2 a lot. This is almost like 3 and 3. There's the lower 3, the upper 3. And remember, to play 3 notes at once, you stick that bow or that arm on the level of the middle string. So for the first part of this, I'd be sticking the bow on the D string level. That's with very little pressure. As I increase the pressure, I can get those 3 strings to ring. So to get 4 notes, I'm going to go from the D string level to the A string level. Right? So one would think, oh, it's a 4-note chord, we've got to roll from G to E. Really, just rolling from D to A. And with a little bit of flexibility in the left hand, we can even vibrate those 4-note chords, give them a little bit more ring. Here, these I like to play almost basically all together. So, one of the first things, we haven't talked about tempo yet, but we'll save that for now. This is one of those movements that, because of its technical demands, maybe doesn't have quite as broad a range of tempos as some of the other dance movements. But the length of the 8th notes, how consistent do we need it to be? And could we even take some of them off the string? This is one movement where I do take some of the shorter notes off the string. I just love the articulation. Places like that. The ones that are those I would connect more, and then the wider intervals. So that's in a broad sense, that's how I'm looking at the articulation for this. So that means that in the beginning, more connected rather than. Sometimes in this movement, as with many Bach movements, it'll be convenient to hook a couple notes, especially up bow. I mean, you should be able to hook down bow as well. Most of the time, we find ourselves hooking up bow because it's a little easier. And we'll do that, or you might do that, because you want a next chord to be on a down bow. So just remember that when you do that, you want to be in charge of the articulation. So just because you hook doesn't mean that it has to be off the string, Could be, but let that be up to you and dictated by the character. Don't just fall into the habit of every time you hook that it's super short. So one more time in tempo. I have a little more powerful the beginning of these lines, or these little phraselets. So So you'll see even those quarters might start to come off just a little bit to get the length that I want. It's debatable whether the hair is really coming off the string. These I might lighten up a little bit shorter. They're skipping rather than stepwise. Here's a perfect example of why I don't want to treat those bass notes as grace notes. The bass line is so interesting. And of course we know that's really just a scale down, even though he's got to skip the octave. And that bass line actually starts before there. Here we are on the B, A. So if I can keep all those bass notes in time and on the beat, then you've got a chance of hearing that. So. Again, we. Let me see what you've got for me here. Ah, yes, Donald. I did trill with the fourth finger, 50% successfully these last couple times. You know, it's not always my first choice to trill with the fourth finger, and we're talking here about the third full bar. That's really all we have time for. Maybe 2, maybe 3 turns. In yesteryear, I would have changed to second position. Now I just stay in first because why shift? And Robert, I'm looking at your question. And it's about this whole question of vertical intonation, 3-note chords, how, you know, you get the bottom 2 in tune, and then it seems like there's nowhere satisfying the top one can go. So then you try tuning the top 2, and then like wherever you put the bottom one, that doesn't work. And yeah, sometimes it's like, I love the passive voice. Compromises must be made. However, sometimes it's a little easier than that. I think that one of the great skills, and you know, if you can play these on the keyboard sometimes, and I'm a terrible piano player, but at least I can play some double stops and 3 and 4 note chords maybe on a keyboard. Then you can compare notes that are not just adjacent. Like, for example, this 4-note chord. What's the single most important thing in this 4-note chord, intonation-wise? Well, it's that the 2 B's have to match. Now, unfortunately, I can't play those 2 together. I guess, you know, if I wanted to put my bow under the strings, then I could. But a keyboard, you can play those across 2 octaves. The one I've got perhaps another way to arrive at the same place. What's the next most important thing? We've got a perfect interval, a fifth. This bot sounds pretty good with the F sharp there. Nice and low. Let's see how that is with the B. Not so good. That interval's pretty wide. Let me put it with the B. See where that might be satisfying. It rings right there, higher. I promise I haven't moved any of those notes. So it's not going to sound great either place. We've got to put it in the middle. It sounds less than ideal compared to either note, but we're not going to be sitting on this note very long. So here it is. And it's going to be just fine. So those, if you know, when you want to get into that kind of intonation, you'll find that you have to make those tough choices. And Daniel, you raise a good point and a question about breathing. And I believe that the character of your breaths really will inform, the character of how you play. I used to have a bad habit of just not breathing for a while, and I had a chamber music coach, surprisingly, who was the one to really stay on me about that. And may have been just a phase where, it was a bad habit for a while. I did seem to grow out of it, but with this coach's help, specifically the first breath, your pickup breath, the last double that we played, depending on the character that I was going to play. That had a really more, I should say too, that generally I breathe out before I play, rather than breathing in. Golfers do this a lot. Target shooters, people who, archers, I couldn't come up with the word. Bow and arrow guys. Archers will do this. Photographers as well. And taking the shot, whether it's a photographic shot or a shot with an arrow, during a breath out, it's just a little bit more relaxing, and it prevents that buildup of stale air in there. So with a slower tempo for the double, perhaps. This Bourree. Now here for the Bourree, quicker, more assertive character. Here I actually will breathe in, because it's going to be shorter breaths anyway. Something like that, pretty sharp intake. So that's a great question. And as for you ask about ominous or darker characters, this is the real art of what we do, but I think that the best thing that you can do is to listen for a sound in your mind and really hear as closely as possible without the distraction of the instrument, really hear the kind of sound you might want. And it doesn't even have to be a violin sound. It could be the sound of a voice, or a sound in nature. I mean, those tend to work better than, industrial type sounds or synthesized sounds, but, or violin sound. That's great if that's how it comes to you. And then to play and compare. And we're not going to have perfect words. I mean, if we had perfect words for all of this, we wouldn't need the music, I guess. But, to come up with some way to compare what you've just heard yourself play to what you had in your mind. And you don't have to know exactly what you're going to change yet, but try some different sound. Try to, with whatever tools you have, to move closer to that sound that you heard. If nothing matches, then you can start experimenting in a more scientific way. If you are always playing with this contact point and you want a more ominous sound, generally, or darker, generally, that's going to be a little further away from the bridge. You will have to change the speed and the pressure to go along with that. Again, I've got a guide on the 3 variables if you want to download that to learn how those 3 variables interact. But the first thing I would experiment with is your contact point, and then find speed and pressure to match. Good. And let me see. Yep, I got a warning a couple minutes ago about a slow connection, so sorry about that. Looks like we're back. let's look at the double, this last movement in the partita. And again, if I just take the same tempo from the Bourree, we've got sorry, a couple wheels came off there. I do like this one on the faster side. I could take this one more contemplative, but then I feel like it's too similar in register and in sound to the last double. That one in 3, and especially because the last dance movement, the Sarabande, was broader and gentler anyway, that lends itself a little better to that kind of sound. So even if the harmonies were okay with for me, it's a little too pale. It's a little too similar to the last double. And this is the end of the, quite a major piece. And so I think it's nice to, while it doesn't have to be quite maybe as powerful as the Bourree, yum, bum, still think it should still sound impressive. Again, the variety of articulations between intervals that are stepwise and further apart. It's, if that's all you do, of course it can sound repetitive, or just unimaginative. But it's surprising how well even just doing that works. And if you combine that with a little bit of direction, for example, crescendo when the line goes up, dim when it comes down, then you've really got something interesting without having to probe even all that deeply yet. So things like that, a little bit more articulation, arpeggios, slightly more connected for the scalar stuff, and I'm dimming as it goes down. So and something that we haven't spoken as much about yet, but rhythmic groupings, right? Goes without saying, but we'll say it anyway. It's boring just to put accents on the beats, right? To bring out the contour, not just in dynamic, but sometimes with timing. So and what comes next, starting in bar 5, right, it ends there. It doesn't end on the beat. And then now. And that's obvious if you play it or even just think twice about it. But it's surprising how many times, even though that's not how it's phrased, that's how you play it. It's just all too easy to land on that, especially because it's a string crossing up. But instead, now why does that work so well? Well, look at the very beginning of the movement, 3 pickups, yeah. So it's not every single one, but when you see that pattern, it can be interesting to bring that out. not here. And now here I believe it's, yeah, so we've got now more duple pickups. Three. Again, longer for the scalar. Let's put that all together one more time. Let me see your comments and questions. How many hours a day do I practice? Well, I will tell you that during this interesting time, with 3 young kids at home instead of being in school, not a great amount, not a great many hours in the day, because they like attention. Violin, as they say, is a demanding mistress. Violin likes attention, but kids like attention too. So, I get to do some in the evening, some during this time, which is a convenient nap time, hopefully. And, I think when times were more regular, playing full-time in the orchestra, it would really depend on if I had outside, solo performances coming up. In those cases, I would try to get 2 hours on a day where I was playing in the orchestra, 3 if I could get it, especially if it was a day where I maybe just had a concert with the orchestra, not a rehearsal and a concert. So in that range, 2, 3 when I've got something coming up, and now not that much. And Ingrid, you asked about the 3-note slurs, and that was something that we had to explore, right? And again, a lot of these are downward slurs. That's really, there's a desire, usually, or a tendency to want to, once you figure out that you need to have the right arm levels for these things, that can sometimes lead to wanting to over-control, to control these, to etch each one. The smoothness comes when you simply allow the arm to move smoothly. Now that can get frustrating because if it's not even, or that's frustrating, and that, again, then you try to take back control. Etudes can help with this, especially, I know I've mentioned Kreutzer number 29, which is a... something like that. There's another one. The number's escaping me at the moment, but res. Along similar lines. So the object is to keep the same even speed for the notes, but a smooth arm. So you kind of just have to find a study for that and spend some time with it. The articulations for this one, the mixes of slurs, excuse me, I just want to flip to the back of the book here, and those come from Bach. So as we were talking about earlier, the last double didn't have any slurs at all, which leads me to believe that you're free to put them in where you like. In a movement like this, where he's already put in so many, I'd be less likely to do variations on the bowing. It's not to say I would never, but I would be less likely to because it's already written in such an interesting way. Great. as I said, this has been really fun for me, especially with this piece that I haven't performed nearly as many times. My ideas aren't as set as they might be in some of the other pieces. I hope always to keep an open mind with this wonderful music, but this was an especially interesting piece, this B minor partita. If you're willing, come back next week. We're going to get into the second sonata, A minor, another juicy fugue to, chew on. But just such a gorgeous piece. I certainly can't thank you enough for being here with me. You know what? If you would, share these sessions with your friends. The links that I send you in the email, if you want to just forward those emails to anybody who might be interested, that would be a great way to get more people on board the road trip here, and I would certainly appreciate it. But yeah, share it here on Facebook. If you're on YouTube, send forward an email that I've sent you. And I'd love to see as many of you as I can next week for the A minor. Let me see if there are any last comments or questions that I might get to. And Grace, yeah, great to see you here. What a great way to think about practice time, and it's something I always think about and I try to pass along to. As long as you have good attention span, and you can think of that in a broader sense, like, okay, someone's 9 years old, they only have a couple good hours in the day. Maybe you're not going to make them practice 5 hours. But you can also think of it moment to moment. Like, here's a shift or a slur that I'm going to work with. How many times to repeat it? Well, it's as long as you can have relaxed focus on that thing. And maybe that's 3 times. And then your mind starts to wander. Usually when your mind wanders, it's because what you're trying to do is too easy. There's no way to concentrate on it because it's like breathing, right? Or your heart beating. That's your mind telling you what you're trying to focus on is not worth your focus. It's not worth my focus, so I'm not going to focus on it. Usually, however, the mind wanders because what you're asking yourself to do is too difficult. And somewhere your brain knows there's no way to have success at this. And so I can't focus. There's nothing I can grab onto, says your mind. And so, I'm always looking for that sweet spot where I can do enough repetitions of something, good repetitions, that it will solidify some good habits for me without my mind wandering. So, for most little things, I'm hoping for maybe 7 to 15, somewhere in that range, to be able to do something nice and easy that many times, lock in some good habits, have good focus, fun, success, and then move on. So yeah, both in the larger sense, how many hours in the day, but also in the smaller sense, how many times to repeat something, as long as you have good attention span. All right. Thank you, guys. I'm going to sign off for today and for this piece. So we'll see where Bach goes next. Seems to be working his way east, and I suspect that's going to continue. So I will see you next week for the A minor. Bye.